Good afternoon, everyone. So, after a brief pause in our seminar series, let's resume our 2026 seminar series. And this week, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor François-Xavier Coudert. Professor Coudert is a French CNRS senior researcher at the Institut de Recherche de Chimie Paris and professeur attaché at École Normale Supérieure. His research focuses on molecular simulation across multiple scales, from first principle methods and ab initio molecular dynamics to classical molecular dynamics, Monte Carlo simulations, and mesoscopic modeling. He's also particularly interested in the physical chemistry of porous materials, including fluid adsorption and the behavior of nanoconfined phases. So we would like to welcome Professor Coudert, and thank you so much for being here today with us, and please feel free to start your presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So thanks again for the invitation. It's really great to be talking about this topic today. And I'm working in Paris for CNRS, and I'll be discussing a bit today the way that we use more and more in our group data science methods for the discovery and the understanding of the behavior of nanoporous materials. So in particular, why we came to this specific topic is that we were interested in the group in the properties of metal organic frameworks among nanoporous materials specifically. And these metal organic frameworks, they've more and more known, and due to the Nobel Prize now, I need less and less introduction. But we've been playing with them because they are a combination of metal and organic linkers. They have a wide gamut of composition possible of, you can play with the organic chemistry, you can play with the coordination, the geometry. So like all nanoporous materials, they have application in gas, in adsorption, separation, in catalysis, in a lot of things, but they're a bit more versatile, let's say, than conventional adsorbents. And so we've been playing with those. And two things in particular have interested us is the fact that they have a high structural flexibility of their frameworks, many of them at least, and also that they tend to have a limited stability, whether thermal, mechanical, or chemical. So we've been trying to play with these, and we've been trying to play with the many variables. So that's one topic already. They have a lot of the chemical space and the parameter space is huge because you can change the metals, you can change the chemistry of the organic linkers, you can change the topology, you can have guest molecules, you can have several guests, you can change temperature, pressure, composition. So there's a lot of variables to study, and systematic experiments, and even we'll see systematic simulation at the atomistic level become difficult to perform. So this is why they're of interest to us. So many variables to play. It's a great sandbox. And as I've said, in particular, we've been interested in identifying materials that have large structural transformability. One of our colleagues in Japan, Professor Kitagawa, calls them soft porous crystals. So they can transform reversibly between states. And of course, when their structure changes, their properties, physical and chemical, also change. And so you can play with one variable, with a stimulus, you can change the structure, it changes the property, and their response along a second axis becomes different. So again, a lot of fun to play with. In particular, we've been trying to identify and find what we call metamorphs. So they're metal organic frameworks with behavior that should be forbidden, or at least be unusual in the world of materials or in the chemistry. So things like negative thermal expansion, negative compressibility, negative adsorption, all of these things are rare, and we've been trying to identify materials like that. And when we started doing this axis of research in the group, I'm a computational chemist, so we were starting with the approaches, the toolbox of the computational chemist. So we were starting with methods from, quantum methods with DFT calculations, so solving the structures of the materials, looking at changes in their structure upon stimulation. We were also doing that with classical methods. So we have a large range of computational method for modeling these materials and adsorption inside of them. And all of these methods, they've been developed in the past decades. They're really, each of them individually is well developed, whether it's DFT, molecular dynamics, Monte Carlo, simulation. So there are lots of methods, and they can all address different aspects of the material, of their properties, whether it's the structure, the dynamics, the thermodynamics, the electronic properties, the reactivity, if you want to go towards catalysis. So, and by using one or more of these methods, you can definitely, for one material, understand one phenomenon. Okay? But the idea is that this takes a lot of resources and time, and also that we want to start and use data-based methods in order to speed things up a little bit, because as we see, there are so many variables, so many materials possible that we're not going to be able to study them all. Okay? So when we started using database method for this reason. When we look at the way that these database methods or machine learning or AI, the terminology is not really important at this stage, but when we look at the use of these database methods for material sciences, chemistry, we're seeing that there is a range of tasks that they can help us perform, from prediction of property, high throughput screening, understanding of the clustering of molecule, reduction of dimensionality. So there are a lot of tasks that you can, where database methods can help you. So some of the ones that we are doing in the lab are circled in pink. So we're addressing several of these fronts, and today I'll be particularly discussing the prediction of properties and the high throughput screening. Again, why are we using database method? Part of the reason is because we have data. That sounds obvious, but it's not always the case. As we know, in chemistry, it's an experimental field mostly. And data is expensive to produce. Running experiments is expensive. It costs time, it costs money to run, it costs chemical compounds, lab space. So yeah. But still, there are lots of materials being synthesized in the MOF field in particular. So when you look at the number of MOFs over the year, you can see that, there are too many papers to read, and actually too many structures now to know all of them, or even watch or see all of them, inspect them. So we're in the tens of thousands of structures just for the MOF family. So this means we are ready to be using, we're at the scale where we can start using a database method. If we look at the typical way that people use machine learning and database methods in the material sciences, they typically want to do things like supervised learning, which is prediction of properties based on previous data. So what you start with at the top is you start with data sets that can be, proprietary. They can be your lab's own data. They can be things that other people have published. They can be things that you have bought, data that you have bought access to, or just online databases that are publicly available. So, but you start with data, you clean it, you process it, And this is the ground truth. This is what is already known in the field, and you want to now to train models and algorithms based on this data so that they perform prediction in the future for other materials. Of course, you're not interested in predicting what is already in your data set. You're interested in predicting new things. So you use the knowledge. Your model should encode somewhere the knowledge derived, statistical knowledge derived from the data sets, and be able to make predictions from that. So this is typically called supervised learning. This is one of the main things that we're using in the field, and this is so the workflow of some of the things that I will be discussing today. So when we do that, we have to remember ourselves. We have to remind ourselves, though, that the predictions we're going to get are limited by the quality of our models, but most importantly, but the quality, diversity of the data that we have, okay? And of course, if we don't have a lot of data, the model might be poorer. If we have a lot of data, but it's all full of noise or it's all too similar, we also would have a model with a bad accuracy. And also, if we want to make predictions on things that are very different from our training data set, then we will undoubtedly fail. So we need to stay within reasonable distance of things that we've seen. If I teach the model all about moths and only about moths, it's not going to be able to predict like zeolite performance, for example. And because of that, we inherit in our models some of the biases from our training data. And that is important to realize and too easy to forget. So what are the biases in the training data that we have? So, for example, we have data on a lot of structures. So because people deposit CIF files of crystalline materials when they publish them, when they discover a new moth, so they publish a CIF file and they deposit it. So we have a lot of data on structures, but we have very little data on physical or chemical properties because there is no repository for that, because people publish it as graphs or numbers or text in a PDF file somewhere. So we have many structures, few data on properties. We also have bias because we have a huge crystalline bias, because if we look at deposited structures, of course, they're crystals. Amorphous structures are a lot more difficult to characterize, and therefore we have a lot less information about them in databases. We also have probably, if you think even in the realm of crystals, you probably also have a bias towards very highly symmetric structures or structures with small unit cells, because the structures with very large unit cells and low symmetry are difficult to, it's difficult to get a good quality structure from diffraction data. So you might have fewer of them. And we also have other biases that we don't know about, which are the ones of the researchers that produce these. So we might, we only know about the materials that were actually synthesized. So we don't know about the failures. They're not reported usually. So that's interesting for us, that we have a bias towards, things that people found interesting, which is not the complete chemical space of all the possible materials. Okay. That being said, let's push a little bit further and start describing some of the examples of what we can do in applying database methods to these material science. And to start with, can we predict the mechanical properties of crystalline materials? That's one of the first. I've told you we want to find these metamaterials, these weird materials. So mechanical properties is one of the direction that we first went into. Okay, so by accident in 2016, our group and collaborators identified a zeolite with a weird property which is called isotropic oxidicity. So it's a property where basically normally in a normal material, while you actually stretch it in one direction, it should get thinner in the other directions. But oxidicity is the opposite. It means you stretch the material in one direction and it gets larger in all the other directions. So this is interesting. And complete oxidicity means that in all directions where you stretch, it will get larger in all directions. So no matter how you stretch, all the other perpendicular directions get larger. So this is interesting, and this is particularly interesting because there are very, very few crystals that have this property. Actually, we could only find 5 crystals in the entire literature that have this property, so that's how rare it is. So that was for us, we didn't know what to do with that knowledge, but we also said that when people call certain properties rare, so for example, negative linear compressibility is also called rare. It's a different response. You put hydrostatic pressure on all the side of your materials, and you see if some of them expand. So it's different from oxidicity because oxidicity is a linear phenomenon, linear constraint, and compressibility is a hydrostatic isotropic constraint. So this is so negative linear compressibility can also happen. It's also called rare. But if I do even just a Google search, I found at least 50 papers that display this rare phenomenon. So we started to ask ourselves, among those behaviors that are considered rare, can we put numbers on that, right? What is rare? What does it mean? So we started with that, and we started to look at the mechanical properties of crystal in the linear regime. It's a very actually relatively easy to characterize computationally. It's something that has been studied by so many groups. So it's well described for decades. You can derive the entire tensor of elasticity in the linear regime from linear response theory. So you just strain your system in a few directions dictated by symmetry, and by measuring the response, you can do that with DFT calculations. It's just a few DFT calculations for one material, so it's relatively cheap, and you can do it at a large scale. In fact, people have done it at a large scale, and there is already some literature on the topic. And there is even a database. So the Materials Project database online contains data on, so this is for inorganic materials, but it contains data on both experimental and hypothetical inorganic crystals. And it contains, for many of them, it contains elastic properties calculated by DFT that people have calculated and contributed to the project. So this is interesting, and it gives us a sandbox to play in. So we started to use this materials project. We found data, elastic data at the DFT level for this, for more than 10,000 structures. Again, this is good because that's a big number, gives us enough data to play with statistically. And we started applying at a large scale, so this tensorial analysis. So if I go back a little bit, I take for every material this elastic tensor that you see, and mathematically from that I can derive, which ones have negative compressibility, negative Poisson's ratio, which is oxidicity, etc. And we find things like, for example, 3% of the crystals in that database have negative linear compressibility. So, okay, I understand why people say it's rare. But 0.3% of crystals have complete oxidicity. So we can see that between two things that are considered rare, there is one order of magnitude difference. In fact, we tried to go a little bit further, and we've tried to analyze these crystals with complete auxeticity. And this is one of the parts of the talk where I tell you something that we actually failed to do. So we looked at all these materials, at this list of materials that have complete auxeticity. Here is a table. It's about half of the table. So there are about, I think the total list is about 40. But if you look at the list, you can try and find patterns. We never could. We tried everything. We looked at the chemistry, the composition. No, there are things in there that don't look like each other. We looked at the symmetry group. Nope. We looked at the space groups. We looked at a lot of things, densities, coordination. We cannot see a pattern. So we know that these materials, they have a specific property in common. But right now, this is something that database models are not able to characterize or to fully capture. So this is ongoing work. If you have ideas, you can contact me. But we've not been able so far to get this very rare, very weird property. Okay. So we went a step back and decided that there are elastic properties, mechanical properties that are easier to actually identify than this very, very, very weird thing. So we started by trying to make things simpler and take a data set that is homogeneous in chemistry. So we took pure silica zeolites, so a series of structures, some of them known experimentally, but most of them hypothetical. And the good thing is you can start to see what is the effect of like topology and geometry, because they all have the same atoms. It's only SiO2 polymorphs, right? So there is no chemistry this time. And you can start playing and make models and figure out of these zeolites. You can run calculations on a lot of them and start trying to figure out which one have weird properties, which one are anisotropic, which one are auxetic, etc. It's kind of a needle in a haystack problem, because I've shown you before, if we look at auxeticity, complete auxeticity is a property that 0.3% of the materials in the database had. So out of 10,000, you have like 40 materials that have this property. So it's a very unbalanced problem, an unbalanced problem with very few positives out of the total number of data points. They're very hard for statistical studies because you have all of these materials that don't have this property, but because they don't have this property, it brings you relatively little information. Okay. So we figured we needed a bit of a clever approach to tackle that. And I don't want to go too much into the detail, but we decided to do like a multi-stage approach. So you combine different layers of computational chemistry and database methods to do the job. So you start with a database of 500,000 hypothetical structure. You sort them with a really bad approach, which is a classical force field, which for these zeolites is okay. For some properties, it can be good, but we think that auxeticity is difficult for it to describe. But still, it's probably better than just, dumb luck. So we use that as a first filter. Then we draw subsets of the structures that are predicted as auxetic and non-auxetic by the force field. We refine those with DFT, and we use that to train a predictor. And then what we do, we've done this, then we can do a second loop. We can now apply this predictor, identify structure, go back to the top. Instead of the force field, we apply this first generation of predictor. We sort the structures, redo DFT, enrich, and as we do that, we improve our aim and we improve the accuracy. I don't want to go into all the details again, but what this means is when we do that with a classical model, we reach a point where about half of our predictions are true. And that sounds, you're going to tell me that's really bad, right? If I tell you I can predict only half of the, I'm right half of the time, that sounds bad. But actually, if you're trying to predict something that occurs in only less than 1% of the times, being bad half of, being wrong half of the time is not that bad. Why? Because it gives you a first level of screening that you can apply. And it all depends in the balance between the false positives and the false negatives that you get. Because I'm interested in the rare things, I don't really mind having false positives, because those materials I can still test later. But I don't like false negatives. Okay. So we did that, and then we went a little bit further, because this is predicting just one scalar property, the auxeticity, but more modern methods, such as that shown in the paper here and developed by the group in Berkeley National Lab, have started to use deep learning methods. So basically neural networks that can predict entire elastic tensors of materials based on their atomic structure. And to do this, you use, this is again, because it's a neural network, it's deep learning, so you're training it on a data set. So you can take the same data set that I showed before, the materials project data set of elastic data, and use that to train a neural network. In the original paper, they described it as a way to predict the bulk modulus, which is an interesting test, but it's rather, I'm not criticizing, to be clear, but it's a rather easy test to match, because the bulk modulus is basically the tensor of the trace of the elastic tensor. So the trace of the elastic tensor just means that you sum all the diagonal terms, and this means that if you have errors in your different terms, they tend to cancel out, we found. So if there is noise in your prediction, they tend to cancel out. So it's rather the most easy, the easiest of the targets to meet. So the model is rather good at predicting the bulk modulus. They have some validation graph. We've been extending their method to actually predict a bit more complex things, like the auxeticity. And we're improving the complexity of the neural networks to actually improve those models. But you can already see that you can reach a good recall rate, as it's called in this model. So this is probably what this is ongoing work. It's not published yet. I still like to share it here, and I'm happy that discuss it with people. So this is maybe one of the ways that where the field is moving in this supervised learning, in the prediction of physical properties from structures, is not to try and predict one single scalar property like the bulk modulus, or predict the Young modulus, or predict this or that, or the shear modulus, but predict entire tensor. This is harder, so it needs more complex models, because you need to learn the details of the physics, but it is more powerful approach, and we find that it's actually, it's a better approach. So this is one example of what we do, using database methods, existing data sets, to predict mechanical properties and physical properties of materials. Moving to a second example of what we are doing in the group, when we take databases of materials, and I told you there are lots of MOFs that are known now, can we improve the way that we identify top candidates for like gas separation? Okay, can we find the best adsorbents among a database of nanoporous material? Why this is interesting is because I told you there are many structures, tens of thousands of structures known for nanoporous materials, but there are very few adsorption data points. And especially the adsorption data points that are known, they're mostly on simple gases, and you don't have exhaustive data on gases other than, let's say, nitrogen, methane, and CO2. So if you're interested in separation of other gases, probably there are not so many people interested in like separating acetylene, for example. And so if you're looking for high selectivity of acetylene versus other gases, The literature is rather narrow, but maybe there's a MOF that has never been tested for it, but would be very good. So what many of the research groups that do this have been following as a workflow in the past 15 years, basically, is the one that I describe here on this slide, and it is a two-step workflow using both atomistic simulation and machine learning. So the way you do it is you start with a database of materials, you select a number of them, a subset, to generate training data, and you run molecular simulation. So if you want to do gas adsorption, you would do grand canonical Monte Carlo simulation to get the uptake of a specific gas, okay? And you use this computational data as a training data for your algorithm. So you generate a model that is based on this computational approximation of the physical properties. Then you go back to your entire database and you apply this machine learning model to the whole data set. And you say, okay, now I want to select the best materials. And when you find those, you redo the calculation, or you do the calculation in order to confirm that you have identified, the right things and that they really have this property that you're looking for. So this is a kind of a discovery loop with both atomistic simulation and machine learning. And this has been applied very, very widely. And one of the reasons it has been applied so widely, part of it is legitimate, let's say it that way, in a way, because selectivity is in part driven by thermodynamic equilibrium. And so you want to have a material with a specific uptake or a ratio of uptake for gas A versus gas B, if you look at selectivity. But another reason why it has been so studied is that the GCMC calculations that are the core of this workflow, they're relatively cheap to run. So this is something you can apply at the scale of thousands or tens of thousands of materials easily. And so it is still a bit of a, I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but it is one of the easiest properties in adsorption that you can do. On the other hand, if you're interested in properties such as transport, then you're out of luck, because you want to use the same workflow, but instead of GCMC calculations, now you need to do long molecular dynamics calculation in order to get to the transport properties such as the diffusion coefficient of your gas. And so the computational cost of your workflow has increased 10, 20 times, basically. So this is a bit harder, and either you need to have dramatically large resources, or you need to have models that can learn with fewer data points. So you need smarter models or smarter training procedures. And we've been trying to do a little bit of both. So, sorry, I always have too many slides. So we really need to speed up the prediction of transport properties. And we've been trying to do things like correlations between transport properties and, geometrical characteristics, things like that. And there is some level of correlation, of course. The bigger the pores, the faster the diffusion, etc. So you get some generic trends, but you don't get a very good accuracy for prediction by doing that. Okay. So we want to push it a little bit further than that. So in order to do that, we had to create a data set of transport properties. So we took MOF materials, database of MOF materials, and we started to run these long MD simulations I have told. And this was a project actually led by Arthur Ardiagon, who is now in the Atoms Lab, who is now in Brazil. And so he was formerly a postdoc in my group. And so this is one of the things that he did during his postdoc, starting this project and generating this a large data set of transport properties for xenon and krypton molecules in MOFs. And once we had that, we could run some analysis, statistical correlations, like I'm showing here, and okay, you get some physical insight. But to go toward quantitative properties, we pushed it a little bit further, and we started to think in terms of a different way. So one of the things that has revolutionized deep learning in the recent times is the occurrence of neural networks. So in particular, in the field of vision recognition, these neural networks have really improved a lot in the past decade. And so we kind of drew inspiration from that because you can see, for example, you can consider that the image of the inside of the pores is something that could be recognized by a neural network and linked to some property, right? So just like you can put an image of a camera, CCTV camera of traffic in the neural network and train it to tell you, is the cars going fast or slow? Is there a traffic jam or not? We could put an image of the interior of a material and just ask, how is the diffusion going to perform in this material? Interestingly enough, so there was a group in Greece, the Foudakis group, that was interested in that for predicting uptake, and they developed this idea of using neural networks based of looking at nanoporous materials for uptake, and we extended their work to look at diffusion properties. So the idea, when I say we put the image of a material, what does it mean? I mean by that, we use the 3D map of the potential energy surface of a guest molecule. This is what we consider to be what the molecule feels inside the material. So, right? And we feed that 3D map of the potential energy surface into a neural network to predict the associated transport properties, such as the diffusion coefficient. Again, we based this on a database of MOFs, on the data that we had generated through MD simulation. And one of the conclusions, so this is something we're writing up the papers now, but it works. It's you don't need to be able to tell the algorithm exactly, you have to look for the pore limiting diameter, you have to look for this or that. You can just give it the raw potential energy surface map, and it will be smart enough to learn what are the features that are interesting. Even more interesting, what we found recently is that it does not need to be a very detailed mapping. So like the resolution of the image that you provide, the number of pixels, does not need to be very high. So even with a rather blurry image of the PES, it can still figure out quite well what is happening and what the transport will be. So again, ongoing work, but something that we're concluding these days. So predicting transport properties in nanoporous materials. Finally, I want to say just a few words about another direction we've been taking, which has been to start to contribute to these databases of materials that exist and try to add quality information to them. We've been working on adding information into these databases, and one of the databases that we've started contributing to is the CORMOF database. So it's a database of metal-organic framework structures taken from experimentally reported structures and then curated, edited, and cleaned up into computational ready. So no disorder, no solvents, etc. It's a great effort that has been ongoing for several years, led by Greg Chung at Busan National University. And there is a new version of this database that went out last year, and that that my group was contributing to. So the idea of this data set is, again, you have a very complex workflow starting from the experimental data from database, ESI of published papers, selecting, curating, editing. And the new idea in this recent edition of the database is to enrich the database of structures with some calculated properties. And what we contributed to was to add topology information to these databases. So other groups contributed other properties such as, water stability indicator, heat capacity, decomposition temperature, and things like that. The topology we calculate with a code that we developed in the group called CrystalNet, developed by Lionel Zubritsky in our group, an open source code that you can find on GitHub, and that takes a atomic structure and reduces it to a graph of points, linked points by bonds, and then analyze the topology of that and reduce it into a simple identificator, like a simple cubic or a blend-like or other descriptors, diamond-like, etc. So this software we've applied at a very large scale. It also exists as a web app if you're interested. So you can put a CIF file on there and just play with it and see how it analyzes and decomposes the topology of a MOF, of a zeolite, of any material. And why we've been adding this topology information is because we think it gives us a new way to search for materials with specific properties. We know, if you talk to physicists, materials chemists, etc., we know that there is a deep link between the properties of the materials and the topologies of the bonds. This is true for electronic properties. This is true for mechanical properties. This is a very deep link. So the fact that we can take databases that exist, so the core MOF, but also the materials project, and we upload on the databases the associated topology information, means that first we can get information about what is the most common topology, how they perform, how they are linked, so you can do statistical analysis. But even more interesting, because these databases, they're available through web portals, you can start to filter searches of materials by properties or by topology. So an example that we did recently is, we know that there is a specific metal organic framework called MIL53, which has a kind of diamond shape, so wine rack topology. It looks like that, and it can expand or contract. It's very flexible, and it has all sorts of interesting properties because of this wine rack type framework. So we thought, maybe there are inorganic materials that have the same topology and the same sort of wine rack structure. So the topology, depending on how you decompose it, is either called RNA or BPQ. That's the names. That's the 3-letter codes. Not very useful if you don't know them. But anyway, so we said, can we look at the database of inorganic structures and try and find some inorganic analogs to MIL53? And do they have the same properties? And very briefly, the answer is yes. We could find 25 structures with that. 16 of them are experimentally known materials. And there is in these materials one family that emerged that has a specific coordination with BF cis octahedra. B is a metal, and then some linkage. And we did calculations on a few of them, DFT calculations, to confirm their mechanical behavior. And they're indeed very flexible. They have auxeticity, so they have many of the properties that the MIL53 MOF is known for. So we found that it was, it's a new way to search through and browse through databases of materials by adding this topology information. And we hope that people are going to like it and are going to use it. So with that, I hope that I gave you 3 examples of how we use database methods to better improve our identifying new interesting materials, better improve our understanding of how materials work, and try and offer, enrich the tools that are available for the community, and enrich the database that are available. I think I'm at the end of my time, so I thank you again for this invitation to discuss. And I leave you with just two references from the group that are relatively, introductory type text. So if you're interested in these topics, you can have a read. They should be accessible to anyone.